Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and today we are here with a Vietnam veteran who has written a couple of books, and I personally enjoy Vietnam books quite a bit. Growing up, I never read them or anything, but since starting the show, I've had a couple of guests on who served during that time, and I've read their stories, and it's like watching a movie when I read those books. Like it's so hard to imagine, at least me at my age, that this was real, that these are real characters who did this stuff, because it just seems like one of those war movies you would have watched on TV, but we are here with a man who lived it. He's going to tell us how it was. There's a lot of misconceptions about it. Even nowadays, there's still so many lingering thoughts about it. We've seen a positive shift in the treatment of Vietnam veterans, as we discussed on the show, but that initial reaction, many were spat on, booed, not welcome home. And so I think having these conversations, even though it's been so long since Vietnam, helps perpetuate giving them back the respect and honor that they deserve, that, they were very mistreated. And then also helping prevent, no matter what happens in the future, we know that we have that respect for these individuals, most of whom were forced or drafted into service. So, Mr. Conard Hogan, I'd love for you to tell us about that and introduce yourself for us.
Okay, be happy to. I may stumble a little here and there. And my caveat about Vietnam, of course, and everyone should probably assume this, is I can only speak from my personal experience.
Right.
So uh, we had, oh gosh, I don't know how many, 2 or 3 million servicemen involved in Vietnam. And so there's that many stories. Each of them are slightly different.
Yeah.
Um, a little bit of background about me first, I guess. I grew up in Kentucky. Wrote my memoir. That's my first book. Whoops, right there. About growing up in Kentucky. Um, Wanted to become an astronaut. Got into engineering school. My grades weren't too bad or too good. I was on probation. My eyes got bad. I decided I couldn't become an astronaut. Um, Dropped out. And after about a year, this was in 68, I dropped out of engineering school. Beginning uh, of 69 in January, I was inducted into the Army. Um, let's see. And so I wrote, that's my book then about my experience in the Army in Vietnam is about the difficulty I had with it. Um, I ended up suicidal toward the end, and particularly after I was discharged. Finally reached out and got some help when I had gone back to undergraduate school at Western studying sociology. At that point, I think that saved my life. Then I immigrated to California after that, got a degree, a master's degree in marriage and family child counseling, was licensed as a marriage and family therapist, worked 25 years after I've received my license. At first, you have to do an internship. So I did that for about 2 years. Got a license, practiced for 25 years before I retired as a marriage and family therapist, working with individuals with drug and alcohol problems in various nonprofit programs. And then later on, moved a little more into nonprofit programs dealing with psychiatric disorders, major, like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, so forth. Retired in '05. I started having an interest in writing about 1980s when I was doing some mountain climbing. And I'm working on a third book, by the way, related to those experiences. Um, and so when I retired, I got much more involved and interested in writing and got my first book, Once Upon a Kentucky Farm, published in 2022. And then my second book, the Vietnam book, Barbwire, Brothels, and Bombs in the Night, published in 2023. Um, so since my retirement, I've been focused on writing, and I've liked to do other things all my life. I've liked hiking. Um, Gotten interested in pottery about 25 years ago. Still working to make pottery. Um, love travel. Um, I do have, as you see, the background here is the background for my website, and I do blog on my website about my travels, some about the 12 steps, not a whole lot, and about my hiking on the Pacific Crest Trail. So there's a lot of information out there about me and my background. So that's kind of a long summary, but maybe
Right.
you have a question to lead me from here.
Yeah, for sure. There's a couple of things I want to focus on, starting with, you talk about having an interest in writing since the 1980s, but when you wrote your two books, I mean, what was the point behind them? One, obviously, it was probably therapeutic to you in some senses and helped you realize a lot, as most
Exactly.
writers discover. But what do you hope the readers will take from it? Reading about Vietnam and a young man growing up on a farm in Kentucky. I mean, how does this affect Mr. Whiskey? How does it affect, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so? What can we get out
hmm
of it?
hmm Uh, there's a couple of paths I can take on this.
For sure.
Yes, it is. Um, I knew before I got these books published when I was writing them that I wanted to share this about myself. I and both of them are focused around my trauma of childhood, growing up in Kentucky, trauma in Vietnam. I knew I wanted to write about that to as a not the final stage of my recovery process. Recovery is not ever completed. Um, Let me say a little bit about that in a minute. The first stage of recovery, you have to own, you have to realize, you have to accept that there's a problem. Maybe that's half the work right there. Then perhaps you need to share it with a higher power if you believe in a higher power. The next step is you got to talk to somebody else about it. You got to verbalize it. You got to get it out. Um, Ideally, and it doesn't work too well if you don't have someone that can't accept what you're saying without judgment, but you want to have someone who will listen to you without judgment, not criticize you about it, and hopefully maybe guide you a little bit with it. But that last part's not necessarily absolutely necessary. I think the next step is writing, at least for me. So
Right.
that's what I had in mind when I was writing these books. Now, I started writing in the 80s about climbing. I don't know if that was the case, if it was so much about trauma. I had fear of heights, but I had liked reading about other authors who had been mountain climbers. And so I wanted to kind of feel like I was like them, to kind of be bigger than and relate to these historical famous people. Um, but it became more clear to me when I got closer to when I started writing Kentucky Farm and getting nearer to publishing that. Um, let's see. So about trauma, I struggled with it. Um, the saving grace for me when I was growing up as a child, dealing with my trauma, was my mother and my two grandmothers, particularly my maternal grandmother. She never criticized me. She gave me space to be who I was, and I didn't act out a lot around her. I was a decent kid, but I always felt like I was safe with her. And then my second book in dealing with my trauma about that in the counseling, Edith Alpe, who I dedicated the book to, I felt epitomized that kind of acceptance without criticism. Um, I was hoping as I wrote these and got them published and still do, that if they help one person, that would be great, but the more the merrier, so to speak, that people can read them, even though they're not a how-to, um, will relate to them in some ways and gain some inspiration on what they can do to take steps in their further recovery on their own trauma. And I do believe everyone in life has trauma. Not everyone ends up with PTSD, but all of us
Right.
have trauma to different degrees, different times in our life, different ways, um, and it's all about how we deal with it. Um, so I'm hoping that people read those and can relate to those, not just as an interesting story with some interesting historical background, but also inspiration in how they can deal with those little or big experiences of trauma that they have or have had.
Yeah,
So I'm
so
wondering if I covered that for you.
you did for sure. And, speaking of trauma, I just want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into Vietnam. You talked about growing up wanting to be an astronaut to, get away from this world into a new one. And Vietnam basically did that for you, took you to an entirely different world than what America was at that time. So, can you tell us about, what were you doing in the army when you got sent over to Vietnam and how did that unfold from there?
Mm, well, as I said, I dropped out of engineering school, and I didn't want to enlist in the Army. I wanted to become a pilot in the Air Force. And actually, when I was in engineering school, I joined Air Force ROTC. But because my eyes went bad, my grades weren't good. That kind of iced the
Right.
cake for me, and I said, I'm not going to be an astronaut. And my dream of that, which I had been working toward since probably the eighth grade, so 5, 6 years, kind of fell apart. And I didn't know what to do. And so when I dropped out of school, engineering school, I was in limbo. And at some point, the draft board found out about that and said, we want
Right.
you, come on in. So I was drafted in January of 29th of January 1969. And when at that time we went into the military, the first place we went was called an induction center. And that was like an orientation center. That was like getting you the preliminaries and oriented and shaved heads and a uniform and knowing how to salute and how to stand at attention and march and make your bed and all that.
Yeah.
And you're there until you get assigned a basic training unit so that everybody in that basic training unit arrives to start the basic training on the same day. So they're kind of collecting people
Yeah.
from here and
Yeah.
there and getting them organized to start basic training. And within 3 days of being in the orientation camp or so, they told us, you're going to donate blood. Didn't ask us. They said, that's what you're going to do. So they march us around a ways, and all this is among barracks,
Yeah.
pretty much the same as you see the old World War II barracks. And they had us in formation. They separated us. They said, anybody here been in jail, in prison, convicted of a felony, blah, blah, blah. And they had those people raise their hand. They said, you go over there. So they weeded out, quote unquote, all the undesirables, I guess. And and then they said to us, they're going to go off and give blood. So they marched them off. Well, the rest of us, they gave us some pep talk and a speech. And it would, I don't know, 20 minutes or so. And the guy basically said, you have an opportunity um, to determine what kind of job you're going to do, your MOS, military occupational status, while you're in the Army. And we will, if you take a test, that will determine what you're qualified for, your aptitude, and so forth. And if you enlist, which means instead of serving 2 years under the draft, if you enlist and serve 3 years, we will guarantee that or one of those MOS to you. And then he gave us the kicker. He said, I
I
guarantee
knew it.
if you don't do that, you're going to go to NAM in the infantry. And I said, I ain't going to NAM in the infantry. So I took the test and qualified to become, amongst other things, I guess. They only told me about one, but they said intelligence analyst. And I thought, now that sounds pretty safe to me.
Right,
so
right, right.
I,
Compared to infantry. Yeah.
so I enlisted for that. The designation is 96 Bravo 20. Um, so did the training for that. Spent maybe 5 months between basic and AIT and 1 month leave before I ended up shipping to Vietnam about June of 69. When I ended up there, I was assigned to 55th Military Intelligence Detachment, and they were part of 2 Corps headquarters in Nha Trang, right on the beach. And that was about 30 miles north of Cam Ranh Bay. That's a pretty famous place. Most people would recognize that name. Um, and spent my time there. So I was in a non-combat role. I didn't see combat directly, but the one thing after growing up, my father, who was rageaholic and drinking, every moment of every day in Nam, I was aware I could get my butt shot off. A sniper could get me from somewhere, or throw a grenade at me or something.
Yeah.
And we were allowed the first 6 months I was there, approximately. I was billeted in the headquarters compound, actually. We were allowed to leave the compound when we're not on duty, go out to the beach right across the road, go downtown at night to the bars and the brothels and the whatever. And there were times I'd go out and wondering, am I going to get shot? um, the latter 6 months of my time, we were moved and billeted out what we call the pie slice on the perimeter side of the air base or the airfield there in Nha Trang. So we spent time out there. And when we were out there, we'd occasionally get a mortar attack. So it became a little bit more tense for me at that point. Luckily, I was enlisted, and the VC or whomever were firing at us were more interested in the officers. So they'd shoot at the officers' barracks.
Right.
And one time, one of our officers got wounded. He was on the top floor. Mortar came through the roof. It's just corrugated steel. So it was like 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch, maybe steel. Mortar came through, hit the floor in his room and exploded. He had gotten under his bunk, but it wounded it. One of the shrapnel pieces went into his big toe. And so he was
Ooh.
wounded in the big toe.
Oh,
And
ouch.
I visited him after when he was back in his bunk with the bandage on his foot, and he said, "Well, I get a Purple Heart, but they're not going to send me home." So I don't know if that gives you a gist of the whole thing there, but my trauma was not the physical part of wallowing in the mud and seeing people get killed or having to fire, although we did stand guard a couple of times. Um, Mine was the fear of I was going to get wounded or killed. That was very real to me.
Yeah. No, I completely understand that living every day. I mean, you mentioned going to bars and brothels and not barbed wire. Hopefully, you weren't going into that. But, you
No, no.
talked about were you living every day like your last? And do you regret maybe, quote, partying too hard or you made bad decisions? Like, how did that affect your life? Having that constant anxiety and fear that any day could be your last.
Yeah. Well, I went to Vietnam a virgin, and I decided I don't want to. If I died a virgin, that would be sacrilegious, and I decided I'm not going to die a virgin. And having hormones out the yin yang at 20
Yeah,
years
of
old,
course.
21,
Of
I was like,
course.
it's just like a moth to a flame or a moth to a light bulb. And so I was almost compelled in that sense. Um, Now, my strategy when I went downtown, I'd usually go with someone else, a buddy or two,
Yeah,
usually
battle
one
buddy.
one fella. And when we were in the streets, we'd usually kind of it's like I'm amongst the crowd, I'm kind of safe. Keep your eyes open, watch out for each other. And I realize uh, maybe it wasn't as dangerous as I thought, but it could have been. That was the issue. It could have been. I didn't know. Nobody knew. when something was going to happen. You know, who would know if someone coming down the street has a pistol and they're going to plan to, kill the first GI they see? Um, there wasn't a whole lot of that in the terrain, but there was some. Um, and I had a little bit of a, well, now looking back, moral dilemma about, prostitution. Some of those girls were pretty young, and I don't know if they were being trafficked or not. But the way I looked at it, they were trying to survive too. They were experiencing trauma. I think everybody, the Vietnamese people were quite traumatized over this.
Yeah.
Um, so that was one kind of, questionable thing I could judge myself about it. But I think I would say I did the best I could. I wasn't trying to be mean toward people or, malicious. But that might be one thing I'd kind of regret about it. But being young, I think we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if I would say there's a lot I regret about it. After I was discharged, I saved up money. We were able to buy a new car, quote unquote, a new car. At that time,
Right.
they were like $2,000 or $3,000 for us. I don't know if it was a discounted program or what, but I bought a Econo Racer, a Roadrunner, and with the money I had saved up, and of course I received it when I was discharged and got home, um, or when I returned stateside, I should say that. And I used it while I was still in the Army and assigned Fort Bragg for another year and a couple of months. But right about the time I was discharged from the Army and looking to go into undergraduate school again, Western, I wrecked it. I wrecked it because I've been drinking and driving and angry, and so
Right.
that was a pretty clear message to me, not right at that moment, but as I reflected on it, that I was suicidal. Um, and that built up over the next few months. That when I was in Western, I decided I needed to go get some help, so I reached out and started counseling. Um, I could say I regretted driving that night, but those kind of things you can't
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
put into a bigger context. It's like
You needed that.
yeah, well, I did what I did, so
Right.
I'm just doing the best I could to get by.
So what I want to focus on here is a positive message with you talked about being suicidal and doing what most men don't do, especially men of the Vietnam era, which was reaching out for help.
Uh-huh.
And obviously a lot more men reach out for help nowadays than past prior, but what would be your message around that to not just military men, to everyone, but especially military men, the importance of it, the humility of it, and the benefit of it.
Um, well, after my discharge and enrolling in undergraduate school at Western, there was a kind of a quasi fraternity called VOC, Veterans on Campus, and I decided
Mm.
to join that group. Now, we didn't pledge, I mean, um, uh, haze like they would in a sorority or a fraternity, but because we we all knew we'd been hazed by the Army in Vietnam already. So
Yeah.
I think joining, I think if even if um, a veteran, particularly a combat veteran or somebody that's been in a combat zone, um, doesn't feel like they need therapy or they have a major trauma or something, I think being around other people who can share your experiences with you is a start. So maybe something like um, a
American
veterans
Legion.
hall group. I went to one here in close by, and they were doing like a games night. And there was a lot of veterans there with, I think, their spouses, and I don't know if they had children there, but they were socializing with one another. So I think the idea I'm trying to get across here, the first thing, probably really important to socialize with people who can understand you, and then talk about it. People are going to reminisce anyway. My dad did that, although he didn't do a whole lot of it, but reminisce. Um, and and as things, if things are significant enough, how would I say this a different way? Um, if things are disturbing a person, if they're having nightmares or dreaming about it, if they're feeling intense about something and they just can't quite let it go, then maybe they want to dig a little deeper and to talk to somebody um, who may want to help them understand what the root of it is or how they can go about coming up with some skill building and techniques to process it more. Um, for me, I think writing was good. Anybody could write about their experience, whether they get it published or not, or whoever they
Right.
share it with. I think that's good. Um, I don't know, since I didn't use the VA in that way, I don't know how well uh,
That whole
they are
process
at
is,
helping
yeah.
identify PTSD and trauma and doing the therapy for that. Now that changes. It's gotten better probably this last 50 years, but I don't know the state of it now. Um, I can't say, but that's one place to reach out. Then there are crisis lines, suicide lines, and helplines to call as well. Um, that would be the thing I'd say to reach out. But the underlying message along all that is just you got to have connections with people. You can't isolate. It doesn't do any good to be alone.
Mm.
None of us. Well, Aristotle said man is a social animal. Um, when we're in the military, we're going to create those relationships, people, and a lot of times we lose those when we're discharged. I did. That's not all the case,
Yeah.
but reconnect with people who understand the kinds of things you went through and socialize. And like I was said, I think a lot of the VA places around would have opportunity for veterans to go with their families, have family events, and I think that's a great way to keep that social connection with people and not isolate.
Yeah, no, I love that community and support, especially because sometimes we don't want to bring something up, especially to people who we feel like don't care or don't understand. But by being in a group of veterans, it's going to naturally come up. Like you said, someone's going to start reminiscing or someone else is going to open up first. And it really, makes that way for it. And that's why I encourage too, like if it's maybe like a faith-based group, finding like a prayer group or Bible study because you might have questions or conversations you want to have and you don't know how to bring it up, and someone there is going to say, "Hey, I want to discuss this topic," or if it's women's mental health, men's mental health, whatever it may be. And I completely agree that we're social. In the Bible it says it is not good for man to be alone. God Himself said that. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, it talks about how two is better than one. If one person falls down by themselves, they have to get up. But if they have someone there to pick them up, and one person alone will freeze to death, but two can keep warm, and a cord of three strands is not easily broken. So I think that community is so important, and we've discussed a lot on the show that isolation post service where it's difficult. You don't want to just make the military your identity and stay trapped in that. But there's a difference between staying, quote, military man or woman, and then being a part of that community,
Hmm.
being with those fellow veterans or active duty members isn't the same as serving in the military still and it being your identity. So I think it's important to
Right,
separate the two. Because a lot of
right.
people are so focused on no longer being in the military that they don't want any ties to it. And, I didn't enjoy my military service, but I still love spending time with veterans because they understand certain things that just my civilian friends don't understand or they don't
Hmm.
care or reciprocate. So I think it's important, like you said, whether that's I know for me personally, I participate in the bingo nights with the American Legion, and it's a whole bunch of vets, and
Yep.
it's good. Even me as a young man, there's still plenty of overlap between, how the military is. It's changed a lot, and in some ways it's still the same. And so there's
Hmm.
plenty of stuff you said that I was like, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
What I want to ask here, as we begin to wrap up this episode, is are there any more books in you? Do you think this is it? I know you love writing. You've talked about a passion for it since 1980, so I don't see it going away anytime soon.
Well, the one I had been working on the first book, Once Upon a Kentucky Farm, and a little bit about Barbwire brothels and bombs in the night before COVID. But when COVID came and we got locked down, I had two things. One, I wasn't sure about my survival of COVID, and two, realized I was getting older and I had a lot of free time, so it kind of prompted me to publish at that point. So I that's why I got my first book published in 22 and the second one in 23. Um, Oddly enough, the one I'm working on now is the one I started on in the 80s. That's my climbing experiences.
Mm.
I don't know if it's going to be somewhat like a crossover between climbing adventure and memoir. I mentioned earlier, partly it's not so much traumatic in the sense that unless you have an accident on the mountain or something, which, things have happened. But I had fear of heights, and that at times I had to face that with some of the moves or particular mountains I was attempting to scale. Um, so it's somewhat of a memoir based on some of my kind of traumatic, quasi-traumatic experience of that, even though I volunteered to do it uh, somewhat like unlike Vietnam and unlike my childhood.
Right.
Um, and so I don't have a working title at this point of it. I'm waiting for a person who's edited my first two books to finish her editorial comments of it, and then I'll work on getting that finalized and published. And I'm hoping sometime maybe later this year. I'm not trying to be in too much of a rush because I really pushed the first two,
Right.
as I said, and I just felt like, oh, that was just if I had not pushed them so quickly, I wouldn't have felt so burned out. But that was like, give me a break. I can do other things. I've got other things I can do, so I'll work on this third one. Take my time. I'm sure I'll do blogging no matter what I do with this third book on my travels. And my hiking of the Pacific Crest Trail, which I'm working on, and some more 12-step recovery um, themes. And people can read about those if they go to my website. I don't know if I think that's probably available. We've made that available to them. And read a little bit about my first two books too, which are available on Amazon. Um, Third one, I'll get it out there at some point, but I don't want to break my neck over it.
Right. Right. No,
I
definitely.
want to backtrack just one minute on something that came up when we were just talking previously about socializing. If well, one of the dangers about isolation or discharging from the military, let's say, and wanting to put that behind you, if you start rejecting that part of your experiences, you're more apt to create a kind of a festering wound for yourself. Um, if you've got any trauma that's kind of unresolved there. Otherwise, you just kind of isolate yourself anyway. So I think a danger if people are in the military and they say, they're going to cut it off and they don't want to be involved with it anymore, they're rejecting part of their own experiences, which is unhealthy.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that point to
Yeah.
encourage
No, I
people not
appreciate
to
that.
do that.
For sure. And so we'll have the description for your website below with all the links and everything so people can look at your work and as well get in contact with you if need be. But I want to thank you for coming on the show today and sharing this. And again, for sharing your experience. Like I said, it's not something that many have gone through or will go through, but I think it's important to recognize it, to draw lessons from it that are universal, and again, to just better educate and grow as a society for the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. You're welcome. And it was a pleasure. And I hope, well, for all authors, I will say we want to be read. So I hope you go out and read my books and read my blogs, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right. Thank you.
Yes. Well,
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide. Through the waves we ride, jokes and laughter fill the air. On this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side. As one family we will abide. In the heart of the ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.